Felicia Peaches Blakely. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who has already convinced themselves they have nothing left to lose. When youth, desperation, and manipulation collide, the results can tear through lives like a storm no one saw coming. Felicia Blakely's name may not be as widely known as other criminals, but her story exposes the darker side of Atlanta's nightlife scene and raises questions about where victimhood ends and personal responsibility begins. Born around 1983, Felicia grew up in circumstances that seemed designed to break her before she ever had a chance to build anything stable. Her mother never took interest in her well-being, and her father was constantly in and out of prison for offenses involving controlled substances. Neither parent married, neither provided a stable home. She often stayed with her grandmother, seeking the care her own mother wouldn't give. She was also assaulted during her childhood, trauma that would shape the choices she made as she grew older. Around 15 or 16 years old, Felicia moved to Atlanta to join her mother. The city offered possibilities, but also temptations for a teenager with no guidance and no safety net. She got into exotic dancing, using a fake identification to work in clubs. The money came quickly, more than she had ever seen before. She dropped out of high school, moved into her own place, and tried to build independence the only way she knew how. Shortly after moving to Atlanta, she became pregnant. By the time she was arrested, her son was 2 years old. Enter Michael Berry, known on the streets as Dino. Berry had been in and out of prison several times, but he presented himself as something Felicia had never experienced before. A man who claimed to love her, helped support her child, and brought her gifts. Most of the time, he was using the money she earned, but to 19-year-old Felicia, he represented stability and affection she had been searching for her entire life. What she didn't realize was that Berry was grooming her for something far darker than she could have imagined. In August 2002, Felicia, who was only 19 at the time, committed 3 acts of violence with her accomplice Ameshia Irvin. Both women went on a 24-hour spree on the orders of Blakely's then-boyfriend. On August 15th, the pair took the lives of Claudel Christmas, 35, and his friend Raymond Goodwin, 34. Both men knew Felicia and Ameshia. They had been photographing dancers, helping them build portfolios to market themselves. They had no reason to suspect danger from 2 young women they considered friends. On the night of the incidents, Blakely and another woman were with Goodwin and Christmas when her boyfriend called her multiple times and told her to harm the men or be harmed herself. Real-life court reports mention as many as 6 calls from Dino. After the first 2 men were gone, the orders didn't stop. After the incident, Felicia and Ameshia hit up a club in the Buckhead area of Atlanta. There they met 29-year-old Demetrius Twitty. Twitty was officially taken from this world on August 16th. For about a week, the 2 women continued their activities, robbing fried chicken restaurants around Atlanta. There had been a series of robberies at Mrs. Winner's locations all over Atlanta, and the workers at the restaurants had been warned. While at a diner called Mrs. Winner's, presumably about to rob the place, the owner became suspicious and called the authorities. When authorities arrived, they found 3 women hiding in the bathroom, including Felicia Peaches Blakely, 18, and Ameshia Snow Irvin, 20. Wait, 18? Felicia was found with identification that claimed she was 24 years old, but at the time, she was only 19 years old. Authorities said the women also tried to dispose of weapons in the restaurant bathroom. The vehicle they were driving belonged to one of their victims. The duo declined legal representation, and they both admitted to all 3 acts. When detectives interviewed Felicia Blakely, she was remarkably open about what had happened. Felicia's attorney argued that she had been under Berry's control, manipulated and threatened into committing these acts. Her lawyer told the court that Blakely was abused during childhood and eventually fell under the spell of a man who showered her with gifts but turned out to be a harsh controller. Blakely is positive for a serious illness and suspects Berry infected her, her attorney revealed. But Berry denied any involvement, and Irvin didn't back up Blakely's accusations. He was never charged with any offenses related to the robberies and acts of violence. Atlanta prosecutors initially sought the most severe penalty in Blakely's case. However, to avoid the most severe outcome, Blakely pleaded guilty to the armed robbery and taking the lives of Raymond Goodwin and Claudel Christmas. Superior Court Judge Clarence Seeliger sentenced her to 3 consecutive life terms with no chance of parole. In 2004, Felicia Blakely took a plea deal to avoid trial as well as the most severe penalty and is serving life in prison without the possibility of parole. Ameisha Irvin also took a plea deal and is eligible for parole in 2027. Reports state that Blakely and Irvin are both currently serving time at Arundel State Prison. Her son is all grown up and in his early 20s. He is reportedly forging a career in sports as a football player. Felicia wanted him to understand why she ended up behind bars, so she had her story documented in a book that later inspired a television film. Can someone so young, so damaged by life, truly be held fully accountable when they act under the influence of someone older and more experienced? Or does personal choice remain paramount, regardless of circumstances? Goodwin's family said even if Felicia Blakely was a victim of her controller, it doesn't make a difference to them. One family member stated that Felicia could have made different choices, that she did what she did because of who she was on the inside. Felicia Blakely's story remains a study in how trauma, manipulation, and poor choices can combine into irreversible consequences. 3 men lost their lives. Families were destroyed. A young woman who might have found a different path now spends her days in a Georgia prison, her youth gone, her son growing up without her. Whether she was a victim who became a perpetrator, or simply someone who chose violence when other options existed, remains a question that divides those who examine her case. What's certain is that on those August days, in 2002, decisions were made that no amount of explanation or regret can undo. Crystal Mangum. What drives someone to tell a lie so devastating it destroys innocent lives, sparks national outrage, and forever changes how we view justice itself? When a single mother working to support her children steps onto a stage where truth and fiction collide, the consequences ripple far beyond anything she could have imagined. Crystal Mangum's name became synonymous with one of the most controversial incidents in American legal history. But her story didn't end where most people think it did. Crystal Gail Mangum was born on July 18, 1978. Growing up in North Carolina, where she would eventually become a student at North Carolina Central University. Like many young women trying to make ends meet while pursuing an education, she found herself working in the adult entertainment industry to pay her bills and support her 2 children. By 2006, she was working part-time as an exotic dancer, taking jobs at parties and private events across Durham. On March 13, 2006, Mangum was hired to perform at an off-campus residence where Duke University's men's lacrosse team was hosting a party. What happened that night would become the subject of intense scrutiny, media frenzy, and eventually complete dismantlement. Mangum accused 3 Duke University lacrosse players of assault, claiming they had forced themselves on her in a bathroom during the party. The 3 young men she identified were David Evans, Colin Finnerty, and Reed Seligman. The accusations ignited a firestorm. Here was a black woman, a single mother working her way through college, accusing privileged white athletes from one of America's most prestigious universities. The case became about far more than what happened in that house. It became a referendum on race, class, wealth, and institutional power. Protests, erupted on campus. Media outlets camped outside the players' homes. The university responded swiftly, canceling the lacrosse team's season and accepting the coach's resignation. 3 young men saw their lives put on hold, their reputations destroyed, their futures uncertain. But as investigators dug deeper, cracks began to appear in Mangam's account. DNA testing found no evidence linking any of the players to the scene. Her story changed multiple times during interviews with police. Details she provided conflicted with physical evidence and witness statements. The case that had seemed so clear-cut was unraveling. In April 2007, North Carolina's Attorney General announced there was insufficient evidence to proceed, and the charges were dropped completely. The 3 accused men were declared innocent. The prosecutor who had championed Mangam's case, Mike Nifong, faced his own reckoning. He was disbarred and briefly imprisoned for violating ethics standards, having withheld evidence and made misleading statements throughout the proceedings. Duke University settled with the 3 players for an undisclosed amount. For Evans, Finnerty, and Seligman, vindication came, but the damage was done. They had spent 394 days living under a cloud of accusation before their innocence was formally recognized. Mangum, however, maintained her version of events for years. She even published a book in 2008, continuing to insist the incident had occurred as she described. But her legal troubles were far from over. In February 2010, she was charged following an incident with her partner, Milton Walker, though she avoided the most serious charges. Then came April 3rd, 2011. Mangum was living with her partner, Reginald Day, a 46-year-old tradesman. After an argument between them turned physical, Day was found with a deep wound to his torso. He initially survived and told investigators Mangum had been responsible. 10 days later, he passed away from complications at Duke University Hospital. Mangum claimed she had acted to protect herself, that Daya had been attacking her and she had no choice. But prosecutors painted a different picture, presenting evidence that contradicted her account of events. In November 2013, after approximately 6 hours of jury deliberation, Mangum was found guilty. The judge handed down a sentence of 14 to 18 years in prison. For many who had followed the Duke lacrosse case, this conviction felt like a closing chapter. Here was someone whose false accusations had caused immeasurable harm, now facing consequences for a different crime altogether. Supporters argued she never received fair treatment after the Duke case, that her past colored how people viewed her. Critics saw a pattern of behavior that had finally caught up with her. Then, nearly 2 decades after that night, in March 2006, came an admission that shocked everyone. In December 2024, during a podcast interview from prison, Mangum finally acknowledged the truth. "I made up a story that wasn't true," she said, adding that she wanted validation from people rather than from something deeper within herself. She expressed remorse for what she had done and asked the 3 men for forgiveness. The revelation came too late to undo the damage. 3 young men had their names dragged through national media. A prosecutor's career ended in disgrace. A university's reputation suffered. Countless hours and millions of dollars were spent on a case built on fabrication, and Mangum herself now sits in a North Carolina correctional facility, her release projected for February 2026. Her story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about how quickly we rush to judgment, how easily truth can be obscured by narrative, and how justice can be manipulated when people choose lies over honesty. The case she created changed how institutions handle similar accusations, sparked debates about due process, and left scars that haven't fully healed. For Crystal Mangum, the consequences of one false claim continue to define her existence, serving as a stark reminder that deception, no matter the motivation, leaves destruction in its wake. Rosie Ko. When Wall Street's wealthiest men walked into Manhattan's most exclusive nightclubs, they never imagined they were about to become targets in one of the most elaborate schemes in New York history. They thought they were simply enjoying an evening out, ready to spend freely and forget about the pressures of high finance. But waiting for them was a woman with a plan so intricate, so carefully executed, that it would eventually inspire a Hollywood film and spark debates about who the real victims were. Rosalind Keough was born in 1984, the daughter of Cambodian refugees who abandoned her to live with her elderly grandparents at a young age. Her parents were Cambodian refugees who, according to Rosalind, came to America in search of a better life, but got caught up with material crap, nice cars, and the nightlife. Growing up just 20 minutes outside Manhattan, she watched the gleaming lights of the city and dreamed of something bigger than the small-town existence her grandparents could provide. At 17 years old, Keough worked as a waitress at a diner in Nanuet, New York. She quickly learned that charm and personality brought bigger tips. "That's when I started hustling," she explained. "Because you work off of tips. The harder you work, and the nicer you are, the more money you're gonna get." But waitressing wasn't going to pay for the life she envisioned. Customers from Lace, a nearby gentleman's club, would frequent the diner and tell her she was attractive enough to work there. At 16, hoping to earn enough cash to support herself, she walked into her first Queens Gentlemen's Club. On good nights, she'd clear $1,000. The money was intoxicating. Keough was taking classes at the time, but I was making my tuition in one night working at Scores, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, school can wait," she recalled. She worked at several clubs, eventually landing at Scores in Manhattan's Chelsea neighborhood. On her first night there, she made $2,000 to $3,000 in a matter of hours. It felt great to have that power. "It's a rush. You get a high," she said. For years, life moved at this pace. Designer clothes, expensive cars, and money rolling in faster than she could spend it. Then she had a daughter with her on-again, off-again boyfriend in 2000 and stepped away from the clubs to focus on motherhood. But when the 2008 financial crisis hit, banks collapsed and Keough's wealthy Wall Street clientele were no longer spending like they once did. Companies clamped down on expensive nights out. Dancers who once made thousands now struggled to cover basic expenses. When she found herself strapped for cash while raising her child alone around 2013, she returned to the neon lights. This time, she joined Samantha Barbush on a new venture she called fishing. And the beauty was, there was no dancing required. Barbush was able to explain the economic benefit in clients being entertained by multiple dancers. The plan was simple but effective. Keough would go to lounges, bars, and steakhouses dressed in a blazer and pretend that she just finished a long day at work in order to lure men in. People were like, "What kind of work are you in?" "I'm in marketing," she told interviewers. If you saw a black American Express, you knew you had a high roller. You're like, "Oh, we have a shark. We're looking for Hublots, Rolexes, Patek Philippes." The operation treated like a real company. Rosie kept detailed schedules, receipts, charge records, and took notes on their clients. Samantha Barbush handled the marketing while Rosalind Keough kept the books and detailed clientele records. They concocted a substance cocktail that consisted of just a sprinkle of MDMA and ketamine. After testing the substances, law enforcement realized the cocktail had the effect of making men nearly unconscious while outwardly appearing to be awake. In this condition, the women would escort them to strip clubs where credit cards could be charged repeatedly. When the men started expecting intimacy, they began hiring individuals off of sites like Craigslist. "I have my dignity," Samantha told one reporter about refusing to go that far. Rosie took on a role similar to a manager, taking them shopping for new clothes and fixing their hair and makeup. setting ground rules like no drinking or substances. I taught them fake drinking and fake sniffing, Rosie explained. Once the signatures are done, you can party your head out. The two women who orchestrated the plan made up to $100,000 per night. For months, the operation ran smoothly. Then came cardiologist Dr. Zayed Yunan. He woke up to a charge of $135,000 on his card and reported the charges as being fraudulent. According to police, the doctor wrongly believed that he was dating one of the women, which likely played a big role in the scheme unraveling. His report eventually led to the women's arrests in June 2014. Rosie was arrested alongside others. She took a plea bargain in exchange for 5 years probation. It was because of her child that she decided to do so. I'm a single mom. I had a child to take care of. I decided not to go to trial. I decided to just make it all stop. By taking a plea deal and taking 5 years probation and staying at home and focusing on my daughter and just being the mom that I should have been to her, the outcome could have been worse, she explained. She was convicted on charges of grand larceny and attempted assault. Keo and Barbash were given 5 years of probation. They were allowed to keep all the money. In 2015, Jessica Pressler interviewed Keo and Barbash for an article in New York Magazine. This account of the American dream was transformed into a movie, Hustlers, starring Jennifer Lopez, Cardi B, Julia Stiles, and Constance Wu, who played Keo in the movie. Keo also wrote a book about her experience as one of the ringleaders of the scheme, titled The Sophisticated Hustler. Today, she's a stay-at-home mom in the New York area, where she lives with her daughter and her daughter's father. I don't think I was a con woman, Keo insisted. I'm a businesswoman. I was just in the wrong business. Her case forces us to ask difficult questions about exploitation and accountability. Were these women simply leveling an unequal playing field, taking from men who had plenty to spare? Or were they criminals who drugged and robbed people regardless of the justifications they offered? The men they targeted had money, power, and privilege. But does wealth make someone a legitimate target for deception? Rosalind Keo's story doesn't provide easy answers, only a reminder that when people convince themselves the ends justify the means, the line between hustle and harm becomes dangerously thin. Samantha Barbash. In the glittering chaos of New York City nightlife, where champagne flows like water and credit cards have no limits, one woman saw not entertainment but opportunity. She watched wealthy men walk through velvet ropes, eager to forget their responsibilities for a few hours, and she built an empire on their willingness to spend. Samantha Barbash didn't just work in Manhattan's most exclusive clubs. She turned them into her personal hunting ground, and by the time authorities caught on, she had orchestrated one of the most audacious schemes in the city's history. When Samantha Barbash and Rosalind Keo were first taken into police custody in 2014, their major issue was that the cops, and eventually the media, kept referring to them as strippers. Barbash was quick to correct this misperception. I was never a stripper, she insisted. I was merely a hostess and was not going on poles and stuff. Headed up by former stripper Samantha Barbash in the early 2000s, these women preyed on rich men who came to the Hustler Club, New York. But Barbash styled herself as something more refined, a connector who understood how money moved in these spaces. The story begins back in the early 2000s, when Rosie moved to New York City at 17 after dropping out of school and went into Hustler Club, then one of the elite strip clubs along with scores in the city, looking for a job, which is where she met Samantha, then one of Hustler's top earners. Barbash had already mastered the art of reading people, knowing exactly what buttons to push and which clients had deep pockets. Barbash, who already had a decade of experience, took Keo under her wing. She taught the younger woman everything about maximizing profits, about making men feel special enough to open their wallets without hesitation. For years, life was good. Barbash introduced Keo to her clients, men who would coolly drop as much as $300,000 in a week. The money seemed endless, the lifestyle intoxicating. Then came 2008. The 2008 financial crisis precipitated a contraction in Wall Street compensation, with average bonuses plummeting from $184,300 in 2007 to $61,800 in 2009. The free spending culture that had sustained New York's gentlemen's clubs vanished almost overnight. But where others saw crisis, Barbash saw adaptation. I worked during the recession, but it didn't really affect our money, to be honest, Barbash told interviewers. The adult industry never gets affected by that. People are depressed because they're not making money. Barbash and Keo, having met at Hustler Club in 2007, intensified their partnership around 2010 to 2011 amid these persistent revenue shortfalls. They began recruiting associates to form a core group that would exploit older, established executives less vulnerable to bonus volatility. When Samantha gave up performing herself, she recruited a crew of women to lure the men into the club. Authorities said Barbash recruited beautiful club dancers and workers to lure wealthy men back into Manhattan's gentlemen's clubs, where they would get their marks to spend as much money as possible and run up enormous credit card charges. The operation was sophisticated. I would like to think Samantha was the CEO and I was the CFO, Keo said. Barbash handled recruitment and client acquisition while her team managed the details. The process started innocently enough. Women would approach wealthy men at upscale bars and restaurants, engaging them in conversation, building rapport. They drugged them a little, got their credit card details, then got them to spend large amounts on drinks and private dances, all before sending them home to their wives. That was the key. Married men would be far less likely to complain the next day when they realize they've spent a small fortune at a strip club. The scheme relied on shame and secrecy. Most victims would rather absorb the loss than admit where they had been and what they had done. Barbash got the biggest work perks of her life, including a $100,000 paid Caribbean vacation and $1,000 shopping sprees to Louis Vuitton. She described going on an $80,000 shopping spree at 6 in the morning at stores like Christian Louboutin. She detailed escapades at parties with stars and going on spending sprees in her new book, _. In it, she dishes on a Fortune 500 CEO she met at New York City strip club Hustler in 2008, who'd spend up to $70,000 a night. Then came Dr. Ziad Yunan. Unfortunately, the scheme fell apart in 2014 after the women preyed on single cardiologist Dr. Ziad Yunan. After being shocked to find an American Express bill for $135,000 as a result of a night of partying, he reported the charges as being fraudulent. What Pascucci, Rosie Keo, Barbash, and others involved in the scam didn't know was that by the time Yunan was disputing the score's charges, the New York City Police Department and the Drug Enforcement Administration were already onto them. Samantha was at an ATM when she was surrounded by police and taken into custody on June 9, 2014. The neighbors were staring. "I'm having like a panic attack," she later said. Barbash, Keo, Pascucci, and Rosen were charged with conspiracy, grand larceny, and other charges. Samantha, Roslyn, Karina, and Marcy admitted drugging Dr. Yunan and using his credit card information to pay for lap dances and drinks. Samantha was sentenced to 5 years probation for conspiracy, assault, and grand larceny. In 2017, she pleaded guilty to conspiracy, assault, and grand larceny, receiving a sentence of 5 years probation without incarceration, no prison time, no bars, just probation and a clean slate to rebuild, And rebuild she did. Barbash was in nursing school while she worked as a strip club host. After her arrest, she opened a medical spa specializing in plastic surgery and cosmetic procedures 2 years ago. Following her conviction, Barbash transitioned to entrepreneurship by establishing a medical spa focused on plastic surgery and aesthetics, which she operates as Miss Stay Beautiful. "I own a spa, and am just about to open a second. I'm a business owner now," she told reporters. In 2019, Jennifer Lopez and Constance Wu starred in Hustlers, a film about a crew of former exotic dancers and adult entertainment workers scheming to take money from men. Less happy about the film is Samantha Barbash, the other mastermind behind the scam, who says she is now planning on suing Jennifer Lopez, who plays her in the film. "We're putting a stop to it because she's actually misrepresenting me," Barbash told the New York Post in April 2019. "It's defamation of character." She also claims Lopez never reached out to her, which deeply upset her. "It's my story she's making money off of. If she wants to play me, then she should have gotten the real story. At the end of the day, I did have a court case that I pleaded guilty to. I'm not ashamed of it," Barbash stated. While she may have liberally spent other people's money, Barbash does quite the opposite when it comes to her own, and advises young women to think of the big picture. Save your money and invest. You're not going to be young forever. Don't think about the $5,000 Chanel bag. Think about the bigger business, Barbash advised. Today, Samantha Barbash runs her medical spa business, writes books about her experiences, and maintains a social media presence where she shares business advice and lifestyle content. She transformed her notoriety into entrepreneurship, turning her past into a brand. Her case asks uncomfortable questions about accountability and consequence. How does someone who admitted to drugging people and stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars walk away with probation? Does resourcefulness excuse wrongdoing when the victims are wealthy men who were seeking their own questionable thrills? Samantha Barbash built an empire on exploitation, served no time behind bars, and emerged with a business, a platform, and a Hollywood film inspired by her crimes. Whether that represents justice or simply another successful hustle depends entirely on who's telling the story. Michele Hughes Linehan. There's an old saying about playing with fire. Sooner or later, someone gets burned. But what happens when you're juggling 3 different flames at once, each one believing they're the only light in your life? For one young woman in the frozen wilderness of Alaska, this dangerous game would end not in a gentle fizzle, but in gunshots echoing across a desolate trail and a body left to be discovered by unsuspecting workers. The question that would haunt investigators for over a decade was simple, yet impossibly complex. Was she a master manipulator who orchestrated murder, or simply a woman whose complicated romantic life coincided with unthinkable violence? In 1994, Michele Hughes arrived in Anchorage, Alaska, with dreams of building a better future. She had left her Louisiana hometown years earlier, first trying to make it in New York's modeling world before heading north in search of opportunity. What she found was work at the Great Alaskan Bush Company, one of Anchorage's most well-known establishments where dancers could earn thousands of dollars each night. Michele wasn't the most skilled performer, but she possessed something that proved far more valuable in that environment. The ability to connect with people, to make them feel understood, special, chosen. Among the men who walked through those doors was 35-year-old Kent Leppink, a commercial fisherman from Michigan who had come to Alaska seeking a fresh start after troubles with his family's business back home. Shy and somewhat awkward, Kent was immediately drawn to Michele. She was everything he wasn't: confident, outgoing, magnetic. After just 1 month, he proposed. She said yes. What Kent didn't realize was that he wasn't the only man wearing her promise. Scott Hilker, a power plant worker separating from his wife in California, had also fallen under Michele's spell and believed they were building a life together. Then there was John Carlin III, a grieving widower from New Jersey raising his young son alone after his wife's passing from cancer. He met Mekele in the summer of 1995 and proposed around Christmas. Remarkably, all three men moved in together with Mekele in Anchorage at various times, with at least two romantic partners always present in the house. It was a powder keg of emotions, jealousy, and competing claims to one woman's affection. But Kent was making serious commitments. He took out a $1 million insurance policy, initially naming Mekele as beneficiary. He transferred assets into her name. He genuinely believed they would spend their lives together. Then, in late April of 1996, something changed. Kent removed Mekele as the primary beneficiary of his insurance policy, naming his father instead. Just days later, he wrote a letter to his parents with stark instructions. "Open this only if something happens to me." The letter was chilling in its clarity. If his passing appeared suspicious, he wrote, "Look at Mekele Hughes, John Carlin, and Scott Hilker." On May 2, 1996, utility workers made a grim discovery on an isolated road near Hope, Alaska, roughly 90 miles from Anchorage. Kent Lepink lay on the ground, having been shot 3 times with a .44 caliber Desert Eagle handgun. The investigation began immediately, but with little physical evidence and a tangled web of relationships to untangle, the case eventually went cold. For 10 years, life moved forward. Mekele left Alaska, returned to Louisiana, attended veterinary school, and in 1998, married Colin Linehan, a medical student, just one day after his graduation. They moved to Olympia, Washington, where she earned a master's degree and became what her neighbors described as the perfect suburban mother, active in church, volunteering at schools, running a skincare business. The woman once known as a dancer in Alaska had reinvented herself entirely. Then, in October 2006, everything shattered. A cold case team had reopened Kent's file, conducting new interviews. John Carlin's now adult son provided testimony about witnessing his father washing a firearm in a sink while Mekele watched. Armed with this new information and recovered emails, investigators believed they finally had enough to bring charges. Both Mekele Linehan and John Carlin were arrested and charged with murder. The trial became a media sensation. Prosecutors painted Mekele as someone who had orchestrated Kent's killing for insurance money, allegedly inspired by a 1994 film about a woman who manipulates her lover into murder. John Carlin was tried first and found guilty in April 2007, receiving 99 years. Mekele's trial followed, and in October 2007, she too was found guilty. But this wasn't the end. In February 2010, the Alaska Court of Appeals overturned Mekele's conviction, ruling that Kent's letter and testimony about the film should never have been admitted as evidence. In December 2011, a judge dismissed the indictment entirely. Finally, in August 2012, prosecutors announced they would not pursue charges again. John Carlin never saw freedom. He was beaten to death in prison in October 2008 before his appeal could be decided. His conviction was also later overturned. As of today, no one has been held accountable for Kent Lepink's death. Mekele returned to Washington, though her marriage to Colin eventually separated. The woman at the center of one of Alaska's most infamous cases remains an enigma, either a victim of circumstantial evidence and prejudice, or someone who escaped justice through legal technicalities. The truth died on that lonely road in Hope, and perhaps it will stay buried there forever. Sheila Davalu. Imagine that you're working at your dream job, surrounded by brilliant colleagues, and you've fallen in love with someone who makes you feel like the future is limitless. Now imagine discovering that your romantic partner's ex-girlfriend wasn't just heartbroken, She was a pharmaceutical researcher with an IQ high enough to formulate life-saving medications, but who chose instead to calculate how to end yours. This wasn't a crime born from passion's heat or a moment's rage. This was science turned sinister, intelligence weaponized, and a mind that approached relationships like laboratory experiments where failure meant elimination. In the halls of Purdue Pharma, in Stamford, Connecticut, Sheila Davalloo appeared to be exactly what her credentials suggested: a respected researcher, educated and accomplished. Someone who had built a career understanding how compounds interact and produce specific results. But away from the microscopes and clinical trials, she was conducting a very different kind of experiment, one that involved 3 people who had no idea they were her test subjects. Nelson Sessler was a 33-year-old research scientist who began working with Sheila in 2001. Their connection seemed natural at first, 2 professionals with shared interests who gradually became closer. What Nelson didn't realize was that every visit to her home in Pleasantville, New York, was part of an elaborate performance. Sheila had a husband, Paul Christos, whom she had married in 2000. But she'd constructed an intricate fiction to hide his existence. She told Nelson, her brother, who struggled with schizophrenia, sometimes stayed with her and would become agitated if he learned she was involved with anyone. The brother didn't exist. The husband very much did. By late 2002, Nelson had met someone else at work, Anna Lisa Raimundo, a brilliant young woman who had graduated from Harvard and earned her master's degree from Columbia. Anna was everything. Sheila, apparently, wasn't to Nelson someone he could build an actual future with, someone who didn't come with mysterious restrictions or unexplained absences. When Nelson chose Anna and ended his relationship with Sheila, the response seemed remarkably civil. Sheila appeared to accept the situation with grace. But beneath that composed exterior, something far darker was taking shape. November 8, 2002. Anna was at her apartment in the Shippen section of Stamford when someone knocked on her door. What happened next would go unsolved for months, but the scene that greeted officers was one of profound violence. Anna had been attacked in her own home, a place that should have been her sanctuary. The investigation initially had no clear direction, no obvious suspect, no witnesses. Then, oddly, a woman had called 911 from a nearby payphone, claiming to hear an attack on her neighbor in apartment 105. The caller refused to give her name. That anonymous voice would later prove to be one of the most damaging pieces in the case. Months passed. Anna's family mourned, Nelson grieved, and Sheila quietly moved back into his life. By January 2003, they were together again, just as she'd apparently planned. But there was still one obstacle. Her husband, Paul, who remained unaware of the double life his wife had been leading. On March 23, 2003, Sheila told Paul she felt unwell. When he tried to help, what followed was an attack that nearly ended his life. He managed to escape initially, but she convinced him she would take him to get medical help. Instead of driving straight to the emergency room at Westchester County Hospital, she stopped in an isolated section of the parking lot and attacked him again. A witness saw what was happening and intervened. Paul survived, but barely. He would later testify about the wounds that required emergency heart surgery, the lies his wife had told, and the phone call she'd made not to emergency services, but to Nelson Sessler. The attempted taking of Paul's life unraveled everything. Detectives began connecting threads between Sheila, Nelson, and Anna. Voice analysis matched Sheila to the 911 call made after Anna's passing. More significantly, forensic testing found her DNA at Anna's apartment, a single drop that placed her at the scene. The prosecution's theory crystallized. Sheila had eliminated Anna to reclaim Nelson, then tried to erase Paul for the same reason. In 2004, she was found guilty of attempting to take her husband's life, receiving 25 years. The trial for Anna's case came later. In February 2012, after representing herself in court and cross-examining the very man she'd been obsessed with, Sheila Davalloo was found guilty. The following April, she received 50 years to begin after completing her sentence in New York. Anna's parents, both doctors themselves, spoke at sentencing about their daughter's achievements and the hole her absence left in their lives. They had waited 10 years for answers, 10 years for accountability. As of today, Sheila Davalloo remains incarcerated, serving what amounts to a life sentence. She continues to maintain her version of events, even from behind bars. But the evidence speaks with a clarity that no amount of scientific knowledge can refute. Sometimes the most dangerous chemistry isn't found in laboratories, but in the human heart, when obsession replaces reason and love transforms into something unrecognizable. Courtney Clenny. In the age of social media, identity has become fluid, something that can be curated and packaged for millions of strangers with just a few carefully chosen images and captions. But what happens when the person behind the perfectly filtered photos lives in a reality so turbulent, so volatile, that the carefully constructed digital persona becomes nothing more than smoke and mirrors? And what happens when that instability turns a luxury Miami high-rise into a crime scene, leaving one person gone forever and another facing decades behind bars, all while the world watches through their screens? The woman the online world knew as Courtney Taylor had built an impressive following across social media platforms and OnlyFans, where her blend of fitness content and lifestyle posts had attracted hundreds of thousands of followers. Born Courtney Clenny, she had transformed herself into an internet personality, earning substantial income from her digital presence. Her boyfriend, 27-year-old Christian Obumseli, was a cryptocurrency investor from Texas, an ambitious young man who'd found success in the volatile world of digital assets. To observers scrolling through their social media feeds, they appeared to be a glamorous young couple living the dream in Miami's upscale Edgewater neighborhood. But the reality behind the glossy images was something far darker and more complicated. Their relationship, which began in November of 2020, was marked by conflict from almost the beginning. Neighbors in their high-rise building at One Paraíso complained repeatedly about the sound of arguments coming from their unit. Video footage from an elevator captured one particularly intense altercation where physical aggression was clearly visible. There had been a domestic incident in Las Vegas in July of 2021. Friends and family on both sides had witnessed troubling signs, though each person's account painted a different picture of who was the primary aggressor in the relationship's dysfunction. The afternoon of April 3rd, 2022, started like many others in the couple's Miami apartment. They had been arguing, though exactly what sparked this particular fight remains disputed. What is undisputed is that at some point during that afternoon, Courtney called 911. When paramedics and police arrived at the penthouse apartment, they found Christian with a single wound to his chest. He was rushed to the hospital but passed away from his injuries. The medical examiner would later determine that the wound had punctured his subclavian artery, a major blood vessel. Body camera footage from responding officers showed Courtney covered in his blood, visibly distraught, explaining to officers that she had acted to protect herself. Initially, Miami police treated the incident as a possible case of self-defense. But as detectives began their investigation, questions emerged. How exactly had the injury occurred? Courtney claimed she had thrown the knife from approximately 10 feet away during the altercation. However, forensic experts would later testify that the depth and angle of the wound were inconsistent with a knife thrown from that distance. The trajectory suggested something different had happened in that apartment. For 4 months, Courtney remained free while investigators continued building their case. She left Florida and was staying at a rehabilitation facility in Hawaii, seeking treatment for substance abuse issues and what her attorney described as post-traumatic stress disorder. Then, on August 10, 2022, United States Marshals arrested her at the facility. She was charged with second-degree murder with a deadly weapon and extradited back to Florida, where she has remained in custody ever since. The case has become one of the most publicized criminal proceedings in recent years, partly because of Courtney's social media following and partly because of the unusual demonstrations her defense team has employed. In one particularly striking court hearing, her attorneys presented an expert knife thrower who demonstrated on an animal carcass to support their self-defense theory. Prosecutors countered by pointing out discrepancies in the demonstration compared to the actual circumstances in the apartment that day. The legal proceedings have been marked by numerous complications. Courtney's parents were temporarily charged with illegally accessing Christian's laptop after prosecutors discovered group chat messages discussing how to unlock the device. Those charges were eventually dropped after a judge ruled that investigators had improperly obtained attorney-client privileged communications. The defense has also sought to have the prosecution disqualified entirely, alleging numerous violations and misconduct, though these efforts have so far been unsuccessful. Christian's family has maintained throughout the process that he was the victim, not just of violence, but of a justice system that they believe treated Courtney differently because of her appearance and online following. They filed a wrongful death lawsuit, seeking accountability through civil courts, while the criminal case progressed. As of today, Courtney Clenny remains in custody, awaiting trial scheduled for April of 2026. Judge Andrea Ricker Wolfson recently denied her request for bond, citing the seriousness of the charge and concerns about flight risk. The question that will ultimately be decided by a jury is whether this was, as her defense maintains, a woman fighting for her life, or whether something else happened in that luxury apartment on that April afternoon, something that social media filters and carefully crafted online personas could never hide. Sarah Boone. Think for a moment about the games we played as children. Hide and seek, tag. Simple joys that filled afternoons with laughter and brought families together. Now imagine those same innocent games twisted into something so dark that the very mention of them makes your skin crawl. Can playfulness ever truly become a weapon? And if so, what does it reveal about the person wielding it? The case of Sarah Boone forces us to confront these uncomfortable questions about the thin line between supposed accidents and deliberate harm, between what we claim happened and what the evidence refuses to let us deny. In Winter Park, Florida, a quiet residential area just outside Orlando, Sarah Boone and Jorge Torres Jr. shared an apartment that neighbors described as frequently noisy. The couple's relationship, which had lasted several years, was marked by what court records would later characterize as a pattern of domestic conflict. Both had been arrested before for incidents involving one another. Torres had multiple arrests for alleged domestic violence against Boone, while she had one arrest for an incident against him in 2018, though that charge was ultimately dismissed. Friends and family members on both sides would later testify that they had witnessed concerning behavior in the relationship, though opinions differed sharply on which partner bore greater responsibility for the dysfunction. The night of February 23, 2020, began with alcohol and what Boone would later describe as a light-hearted evening. She told authorities that she and Torres had been drinking wine and decided to play a game reminiscent of childhood. According to her account, they thought it would be amusing if Torres climbed into a suitcase as part of their hide-and-seek game. She claimed they were both laughing as she zipped him inside. What happened next would become the subject of intense scrutiny and ultimately lead to one of Florida's most disturbing cases in recent memory. Boone stated that after closing the suitcase, she went upstairs to her bedroom and fell asleep, believing Torres could free himself since two of his fingers were visible, sticking out from the zipper. She claimed she woke hours later to her phone ringing repeatedly and realized her boyfriend might still be trapped. When she opened the suitcase, She found Torres unresponsive. She immediately called 911, telling the operator that her boyfriend was no longer breathing. When emergency responders arrived, Torres was already gone. The medical examiner ruled his passing a homicide. During the initial investigation, deputies took possession of Boone's cell phone with her permission. What they discovered on that device would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the case. 2 videos, recorded by Boone herself, showed Torres inside the suitcase, clearly in distress. In the footage, he could be heard pleading to be released, saying he couldn't breathe. Boone's voice responded not with concern, but with statements like, "That's what you get, and that's what I feel like when you cheat on me." At points in the video, she could be heard laughing, while Torres continued his desperate appeals for help. The recordings painted a picture that contradicted her claims of an innocent game gone wrong. Sarah Boone was arrested the following day and charged with second-degree murder. She was held without bail, beginning what would become an extraordinarily protracted legal journey. Over the next 4 years, 8 different attorneys withdrew from representing her. 7 of these were court-appointed counsel who cited irreconcilable differences with their client. At one point, Judge Michael Kranick ruled that Boone had forfeited her right to court-appointed representation due to her conduct. During a hearing where she represented herself, she submitted a hand-drawn advertisement seeking a lawyer, which gained media attention and eventually led to attorney James Owens taking her case. Owens attempted to negotiate a plea deal involving a 15-year sentence for manslaughter, but Boone rejected the offer. The trial finally began in October 2024, delayed multiple times by the pandemic, Hurricane Milton, and the ongoing attorney issues. Boone testified in her own defense for approximately 5 hours. Her legal team argued that she suffered from battered spouse syndrome and acted out of fear based on years of alleged abuse. She described incidents where Torres had harmed her and stated that she wanted him to understand how his actions made her feel. When asked directly why she didn't simply unzip the suitcase, she told the court she wanted Torres to try to understand her perspective so he might become a better person. On October 25, 2024, after less than 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict, guilty of second-degree murder. On December 2, 2024, Judge Kranick sentenced her to life in the Florida Department of Corrections. Before sentencing, Torres' mother spoke through tears about losing not just a son, but a father, brother, and uncle. His sister described a lifetime of pain that Boone's actions had caused. Boone also spoke at her sentencing, maintaining that despite everything, she had loved Torres and forgiven herself for that love. She filed for a new trial, citing alleged prosecutorial misconduct, but the motion was denied. Today, Sarah Boone serves her sentence while the questions surrounding that February night linger. Was this a woman pushed beyond her limits by abuse, or was something far more disturbing captured in those videos? The legal system has rendered its judgment, but the case continues to spark debate about domestic violence, accountability, and the stories we tell ourselves when faced with the irreversible consequences of our choices. Omaima, the female Dharma, Nelson. When we celebrate holidays with family, we're supposed to be creating memories filled with warmth, gratitude, and love. But what transforms a day meant for giving thanks into something that becomes a nightmare whispered about for decades? In 1991, a Thanksgiving weekend in Southern California became the setting for a case so disturbing that it forced America to confront uncomfortable truths about abuse, survival, and the darkest corners of human psychology. The question that still haunts those who study this case is whether we're looking at a desperate woman who fought back against her tormentor, or something far more complex and troubling. Omaima Ari Nelson was born in 1968 in Cairo, Egypt. One of 16 children growing up in an impoverished neighborhood near the city's necropolis. Her childhood was marked by hardship and trauma. At just 6 years old, She underwent female circumcision at her father's insistence, a procedure that would leave lasting physical and psychological scars. She lived with her mother and two sisters in difficult conditions, far removed from the glamorous life she would one day seek in America. In 1986, 18-year-old Omaima immigrated to the United States after marrying an American citizen, a union that would eventually end in separation. She settled in Southern California, working as a nanny and pursuing modeling opportunities. With striking features and an outgoing personality, she seemed determined to build a new life far from the struggles of her youth. But those who knew her during this period described someone carrying deep emotional wounds, someone searching for security and stability in all the wrong places. October of 1991 brought Omaima to a bar in Huntington Beach where she met William Edwin Nelson, known to friends as Bill. At 56, Bill was 33 years her senior, more than twice her age. He had worked as a pilot but carried his own complicated history, including a federal conviction for attempting to smuggle 100 tons of marijuana across the Mexican border. He'd served 4 years in prison before his release on parole, after which he took a job with a mortgage company. Despite the significant age gap and their brief acquaintance, the couple married within days of meeting. Though questions would later arise about the validity of their union, since Bill's previous marriage wasn't yet legally dissolved. The whirlwind romance quickly descended into what both sides would later describe as a troubled relationship, though their accounts differed dramatically. Omaima would claim that Bill became physically and verbally abusive almost immediately after their wedding. She testified that he engaged in unwanted activity that caused her pain, particularly given her history of trauma. She described living in fear, worried that he might harm her or report her to immigration authorities. Bill's family and friends, however, painted a different picture, describing him as generous and affectionate, though they acknowledged his attraction to younger women. Thanksgiving weekend of 1991 marked the end of their brief marriage in the most horrifying way imaginable. According to Omaima's account, Bill attacked her in their Costa Mesa apartment during what began as intimate activity. She claimed he tied her to the bed and assaulted her, and that she genuinely feared for her life. Breaking free, she said she grabbed whatever she could reach, a lamp, scissors, a clothes iron, and defended herself. Bill passed away from his injuries that night. But what happened next is what transformed this from a potential self-defense case into one of California's most notorious crimes. Over the next 12 hours, Omaima dismembered Bill's body. She boiled his head. She cooked his hands in oil. Prosecutors would later allege, based on statements she made to a psychiatrist, that she had prepared his ribs with barbecue sauce and consumed them, though she would deny this claim. Her defense team argued she was in a dissociative state, experiencing a psychotic break brought on by years of accumulated trauma. The psychiatrist who examined her testified that she described putting on red lipstick, a red hat, and red shoes before preparing her husband details that seemed to suggest either a complete detachment from reality or something more disturbing. When she realized she couldn't dispose of the remains alone, Omaima contacted an ex-boyfriend, offering him $75,000 to help her. Instead of agreeing, he contacted authorities. When officers arrived at the apartment on December 1st, 1991, they discovered body parts wrapped in newspaper in the refrigerator and found additional remains in Bill's car. Omaima was arrested immediately. Her trial began in December of 1992 and became a media sensation. The proceedings occurred while the Silence of the Lambs dominated pop culture, and reporters couldn't resist drawing comparisons to the film's fictional cannibal. The defense presented extensive testimony about Omaima's traumatic past, her history of abuse, and expert opinions on battered woman syndrome and post-traumatic stress disorder. They argued she had snapped under unbearable psychological pressure. The prosecution countered that this was a woman with a pattern of manipulating older men for money, pointing to previous relationships where she'd allegedly used her appearance to extract financial support. They contended she'd killed Bill deliberately, perhaps during a moment when he was restrained and vulnerable. After 6 days of deliberation in January 1993, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. The conviction acknowledged that while they didn't believe she'd planned the homicide in advance, they also didn't accept that it was purely self-defense. She received a sentence of 28 years to life. Omaima Nelson has been denied parole multiple times, most recently facing rejection because board members felt she showed insufficient remorse and continued deflecting responsibility. Her next eligibility comes in 2026. Today, she remains incarcerated, her case still debated by those who study criminal psychology, domestic violence, and the justice system. Was this a survivor pushed beyond human limits, or was something else at play in that Costa Mesa apartment? The legal system has rendered its judgment, but the questions surrounding that Thanksgiving weekend continue to divide opinion, reminding us that even the most extreme cases rarely fit into simple categories of guilt or innocence. Valerie Parashamti. Love is supposed to bring out the best in people. It's meant to inspire kindness, loyalty, and selflessness. But what happens when that same emotion becomes twisted into something unrecognizable? When the desire to prove devotion crosses every moral boundary and transforms into a deadly performance? In 2006, a teenage girl seeking temporary shelter learned the answer to that question in the most terrifying way possible. Her brief stay with 2 young women who seemed friendly enough would end not in friendship, but in a case that shocked an entire nation and left people questioning how far anyone would go to prove their commitment to another person. Valerie Parashamti was born in 1988 and grew up in circumstances that would later be described in court as deeply troubled. Her childhood was marked by violence and instability. Her father had been imprisoned for domestic violence, and she witnessed abuse that left lasting psychological scars. By her teenage years, she had developed what mental health professionals would later identify as a severe personality disorder. She also became fascinated with vampire subculture, claiming to have drunk blood since she was 10 years old. It was a dark obsession that hinted at the violence lurking beneath the surface. In 2006, Valerie was living in a share house in the Lathlane suburb of Perth with her girlfriend, 21-year-old Jessica Stasinowski, and their landlord's son, David Ross Haynes. Valerie was 19, and her relationship with Jessica was intense and all-consuming. They had known each other for only a few months, but their bond was characterized by an overwhelming need to constantly prove their devotion to one another. It was a relationship built not on healthy love, but on obsession and jealousy. In mid-December of that year, 16-year-old Stacey Mitchell found herself needing a place to stay after arguing with her parents. Stacey had been born in Dorset, England, and moved to Perth with her family when she was 10. She was outgoing and friendly, describing herself as a party girl who loved music and West Ham Football Club. Through mutual friends, she was introduced to Valerie and Jessica, who offered to let her stay at their house. Stacey gratefully accepted, having no idea that she was walking into a situation that would cost her everything. For the first few days, things seemed normal enough, but beneath the surface, tensions were building. Jessica became increasingly jealous, convinced that Stacey was flirting with Valerie. She complained that Stacey was annoying and intrusive, wearing bikinis around the house while Jessica was at work. The jealousy festered, and soon, both women viewed Stacey not as a temporary housemate, but as a threat to their relationship. In their twisted logic, they decided there was only one way to resolve the situation and prove their love for each other. They would take Stacey's life. On the evening of December 17th, 2006, the 3 young women drank whiskey together in the kitchen. Valerie and Jessica gave Stacy sleeping tablets, making her drowsy and less able to defend herself. Then, as Stacy sat in the kitchen, Valerie approached from behind holding a concrete block. She struck Stacy repeatedly on the head, following her through the house as the teenager tried to escape. The concrete block eventually broke from the force of the blows. Jessica then wrapped a dog chain around Stacy's neck and tightened it. The attack lasted approximately 45 minutes. As Stacy lay dying, Valerie and Jessica kissed over her body, becoming aroused by the violence they had inflicted. They filmed the scene on their mobile phones, making comments and jokes about what they had done. Their housemate David had agreed to stay in his bedroom with music playing, knowing full well what was happening in the kitchen. After the attack, he was blindfolded so he could leave the house without seeing the full crime scene. Meanwhile, Valerie and Jessica stuffed Stacy's body headfirst into a wheelie bin and moved it to a shed. Over the following days, they discussed how to dispose of the body permanently, visiting a hardware store to price chainsaws, shovels, and cement. On December 21st, Stacy's worried parents reported her missing. When police visited the share house, Valerie and Jessica's explanations didn't add up. Officers returned with a search warrant and discovered Stacy's body in the wheelie bin. Both women were arrested immediately. During their court appearances, their behavior disturbed everyone present. They smiled, giggled, and whispered to each other as prosecutors detailed the horrifying crime. The judge repeatedly rebuked them for their lack of remorse. In November 2007, both women pleaded guilty. Prosecutors described Valerie as a sadist obsessed with violence and blood. In March 2008, they were each sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 24 years. The judge stated he held little hope they could ever be rehabilitated. The case became known as the Perth wheelie bin murder, and it remains one of the most disturbing crimes in the region's history. Authorities initially allowed Valerie and Jessica to maintain their relationship in prison, spending hours together each day. When this was discovered, Valerie was moved to a separate facility. They attempted to continue communicating through letters, even using notorious prisoner Catherine Burney as a go-between. In 2012, prison officers were injured, breaking up a fight involving Valerie. A year later, she attempted to escape but failed to leave the grounds. Today, Valerie Parashumti remains incarcerated, serving what may very well be a life sentence. The question that haunted investigators and the public then still echoes now. How could proving love lead to such darkness? The case stands as a reminder that obsession dressed up as devotion can become the most dangerous force of all.